The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's that, Silly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a re-release of an episode from 2020, from early 2020. It's like from just before the pandemic started, actually. This is from season 2 of Vulgar History, which was the season's theme was women leaders in history and the men who whined about them. And remember in 2020, that was like a thing. You know, people used to be not cool with women leaders, but now it's 2024 and it's no problem for anybody, obviously, right? In this episode, what you're going to hear in a bit is me from back then doing an episode about Agrippina the Younger. And so since then, I became a huge fan of the 1976 BBC miniseries Claudius, which features Agrippina because her mother, Agrippina the Elder, is also a character on the show, sort of a bigger character that they call her Agrippinilla, this character. Anyway, so it's interesting to see those events happen in kind of the last few episodes of Claudius after having known the story from doing this podcast. And this podcast episode you're about to hear, my main/only source for it was Emma Southan's amazing book, Agrippina, which has a couple different subtitles, and it's just been re-released in paperback. So just one sec. I'm going to tell you the title so you know how to look for it, and I will put links in the show notes as well so you can get a copy of it. So the sort of like tame title for it is Agrippina, the most extraordinary woman of the Roman Empire. The cooler title, which I think might have been only the title in the UK, is Agrippina, Empress, Exile, Hustler, Whore. Anyway, it's the same book, just slightly different titles. Just came out in paperback by Emma Southan, who I was so excited Last season, I had her on to talk about one of her more recent books as well. All of her books are so fundamental to me. She really combines writing about history in like a well-researched way with just silly jokes and like having a nice time and making it understandable for people who are not necessarily familiar with the history you're talking about. And so she's been kind of a role model of mine. So it was really cool when I got to talk to her a bit ago. And so it's nice to revisit this, the story of Agrippina. I mean, I don't want to say anything else because I don't want to spoil any of the twists and the turns. Anyway, so enjoy this episode. Vulgar History presents Agrippina the Younger. Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, Season 2, Episode 2. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a feminist women's history comedy podcast. I don't know why I made there be so many words in explaining what it is, but I think I've explained it properly in every episode so far. So in Season 1, we were looking at women who made history by quote-unquote misbehaving, which is sort of like also not quote-unquote misbehaving because several of them did murder people. This season, we're looking at women leaders and how men complained and were freaked out about it, and how it's not so different from nowadays when women leaders are still much more rare than men leaders, and men and women and just anyone living in the patriarchy still kind of freaks out about women leaders for exactly the same reasons they did 2,000 years ago. So last week's episode, we looked at Cleopatra. And this week we're kind of going chronologically this season. Last season was kind of like random people. Well, not random, like people I chose, but I sort of put them in order of, I don't know, the order that seemed to work best. But this season, I think what's going to work best is going chronologically so you can kind of see the development of how women leaders were seen and accepted and treated throughout several centuries of Western history, and how so little has changed. And it's all really depressing, actually. But what's not depressing is a scandalous story. And today we're going to be looking at the story of Agrippina the Younger, who is called that because her mother was also called Agrippina. Agrippina the Elder was her mother. And this takes place in ancient Rome. So Agrippina was born November 6th in the year 15, like plus 15. So when we were looking at Cleopatra, she was in the before Common Era scenario. Agrippina is a bit later on. So just to sort of put us in the place and time. So Cleopatra was fighting against the guy who would become Emperor Augustus, aka Octavian, when he was sort of like in his teens/early 20s. Agrippina is the granddaughter of Augustus. So he was quite a lot older. So just kind of Agrippina and Cleopatra were never alive at the same time, but they're not like so far apart that people in the story wouldn't have known Cleopatra and been around for that whole situation, which you can hear about in last week's episode. So this week we are looking at Agrippina. So her full name was Julia Agrippina Minor and I have not done a lot of studying and research of ancient Rome. I kind of did a crash course to prepare for this podcast episode. But it seems to me that everyone who was female in ancient Rome had the first name Julia, but no one actually went by the name Julia, is kind of how it seems. So she's mostly written about as Agrippina. And I also want to mention that the main source I'm using for this podcast is the amazing biography of Agrippina by Emma Southen, it's got two different titles. In some markets, I think in the UK, the book is called Agrippina, Empress, Exile, Hustler, Whore. In North America, it's got a much more tame title, which is Agrippina, the Most Extraordinary Woman of the Roman World. The book is amazing. It's very much kind of like, I've never before read a history book that so much feels like something I myself could have written, like in the best possible way. I feel such a kinship to this book, the way that she puts in jokes and asides and like makes fun of historically powerful men, and just the very casual conversational way that it's written is amazing. And it's also superbly well researched. So I'm using this book as my source. She uses as her source numerous people who were writing in ancient Roman times. And
you can read her full bibliography for what all of her sources are. But basically, just bear in mind that all of the sources she used, like all of the sources that exist about Agrippina, were basically men who really didn't like her and wanted to make her seem as awful as possible, not unlike Cleopatra. So some of the stuff in this story probably did happen. Some of it might be exaggerated. Some of it might be totally made up. But just like imagine the word allegedly before almost everything I'm about to tell you, because we can't really go back and fact check. But there's some, it's like we know when she was born, we know when certain events happened, but a lot of it we're just kind of filling in the gaps based on what these men who hated her claimed had happened. So other than births and deaths, the dates of, everything is kind of like, here's a story. And you kind of get a sense of who she was and what she was like. The details here or there, no one can ever truly verify, really. So, okay. Agrippina. Julia Agrippina Minor, aka Agrippina the Younger, was born November 6th in the year 15. She was the fourth surviving child and the first daughter born to two extremely important and popular Roman people. So her mother, Vipsania Agrippina, aka Agrippina the Elder, was the daughter of two really important Roman people. Her father was Agrippa, who was a really popular and important statesman, and her mother was Julia the Elder, who was the daughter of Emperor Augustus. So Agrippina's mother is descended through her mother to Emperor Augustus, which I guess makes our Agrippina the great-granddaughter of Augustus. So that's the spread of time. Sorry, I said grandfather before. It's like everyone has the same names and are all married to each other. This is not the first mistake I'm going to make regarding how people are related to each other, because it's just like the family tree, instead of a tree, it's just kind of like a bundle of sticks that's just like thrown haphazardly on the ground, like, and then bundled back together. There's a lot of intermarrying, but what is important here to know effectively is that our Agrippina the Younger, was descended very directly through her mother to Emperor Augustus, who was a super long-standing emperor of Rome. He was made a god, like everybody respected him super a lot. Her father was named Germanicus, and he was the nephew of the person who's the emperor when the story begins, who is Emperor Tiberius. So basically, Tiberius is the uncle of our Agrippina. So she's the niece of the current emperor, and she's also the great-granddaughter of famous Emperor Augustus, basically. So she's descended on both sides from basically emperors, even though there's still this thing in Rome where they're like, we're technically still a republic. Like, we don't have one person who's the emperor. It's more just like he's elected and everyone just agrees to keep him the emperor forever. This sort of like pretend democracy. Again, not my area of expertise, but basically it's a situation where everybody loved Augustus, everybody loved Germanicus. So our Agrippina and her sibling and group, her whole family, were just sort of beloved, sort of like when they were little kids, like William and Harry were beloved because Diana was beloved. Like, it's that same sort of thing. Like, people just reflect the popular parents onto the younger kids. Anyway, so her parents, Agrippina the Elder and Germanicus, were the it couple of Roman history at the time. Agrippina the Elder was doing exactly what a Roman woman was expected and wanted to do, and so everybody loved her for that. She was a wife, she was a mother, she was devoted to both duties, while Germanicus was super handsome and a very successful military leader, to the point that when he was born, his name wasn't Germanicus. His name got changed to Germanicus in recognition of how well he did conquering parts of Germany for the Roman Empire. And actually, Agrippina, today's heroine, was born while the whole family was in Germany for invasion-related reasons. She was born in a Roman outpost located on the Rhine River near modern-day Cologne, Germany. So she was born amid the battlefield, basically, to these very popular and successful parents. So the family headed back to Rome a little while later, and Germanicus was hailed as a hero in a major triumphant parade/festival. So these parades, it's not just like, the Thanksgiving parade or whatever. This is like days-long festival. Like, everybody came there, like they paraded through everywhere. Like, it was a massive celebration. So Agrippina would be a little toddler seeing just exactly how much the city loved her whole family. Germanicus died just a few years later, though, seemingly of natural causes. But everyone in this story dies of maybe being murdered, and he is one of them, basically. So he died, and the city mourned in like a massive scale, like again, sort of like Princess Diana's death scale, just like mounds of flowers, just like everybody like weeping, like everyone was so devastated because he was so popular and so beloved. So it seemed like he maybe died of diseases because he was like traveling around a lot, doing battles in a period of time well before antibiotics. But his wife, Agrippina the Elder, was pretty sure that he had probably been murdered by Tiberius, who was both Germanicus's uncle and also adoptive father. So his uncle father, Emperor Tiberius. This is entirely possible. Who knows? But basically, it also makes sense that Agrippina the Elder would assume murder because basically her entire family had been murdered, mostly by each other, like her brothers, her parents, her aunts and uncles. I mean, it makes sense, like, to her, like, that's the normal way most people die, is from interfamily murder. So what happened is that Germanicus died while he was away, and Agrippina, our Agrippina, was a little kid staying in Rome with her other little siblings. And her mother sailed into town from being away with her husband, and she did sort of like a grief parade. So it's sort of like this sad version of the triumph parade that happened before. She reunited with her daughter Agrippina and her other children, and everybody in Rome was just like freaking out about Germanicus being dead. He was like their number one favorite person. They were like pushing over statues, smashing dishes, like screaming, and these like grief riots, like killing themselves. Like everybody was really affected by the death of Germanicus. And so Agrippina, our little Agrippina, who at this point was a little girl, should have been again paraded through town, seeing how everybody loved her father so much, how she and her family were sort of special, sort of different from everybody else. And this really doesn't change too much over the course of this whole story, which is like decades and decades. Basically, the people of Rome loved her parents so much, ergo they loved her and her siblings so much, and she kind of saw herself as special and different and better than everybody else. And basically the way they treated, like she kind of was, in a way. So we move now into the phase of her life where she is a half orphan, her father is dead, and she's being raised by sort of a squad of powerful women. So including her mother, Agrippina the Elder, her father's mother, Antonia Minor, and her great-grandmother, Livia Drusilla, who was the widow of Augustus. And if you watch I, Claudius, the old Masterpiece Theater show, and there's, side note, a new podcast just started called I, Podius, where these two men are watching and discussing episodes of I, Claudius, and I'm really excited about it because I'm very into Roman history at the moment. Anyway, Livia in I, Claudius is this just like ideal Roman woman. Again, she's a devoted wife and mother. She also seemed to have been really proficient at poisoning people and murdering people and being ambitious and pretty badass. So basically, Agrippina, this little girl, is being raised by these like very powerful women who had basically thrived as best as they could in the wildly murderous patriarchy that they'd all been born into. And almost immediately, Agrippina got to watch her mother flex her power in a number of different ways. So this is also just crucial. So like she's a little girl and these formative events are basically being worshipped by all of Rome, and watching her, these influential women in her life sort of sidestep the fact that in ancient Rome, women had no rights. They couldn't own land. They couldn't have their own money. They couldn't vote. They were basically property. They couldn't go outside unless they were escorted by a male relative. They were, I just keep thinking of it. I know I read this somewhere and I forget where, but basically landowners would own, a house and maybe some chickens and maybe some daughters and maybe a wife. And those were all sort of the same to them, basically. But Agrippina was watching these three powerful women find their own way to have power and to be powerful in a situation where that wasn't expected. So that was kind of, to her, that became normal. That became what she figured out her life would be like as well. So the thing to bear in mind here is that the emperor, who is her uncle, Tiberius, was awful. Or no, her great, no. Oh my God, this family tree. Great uncle. So the emperor is the great uncle. His name is Tiberius. He was a really shitty emperor, and not in the way that other emperors we're going to maybe talk about in this story were really shitty emperors, but more in the sense of he just kind of pieced out of the whole thing. He was really serious and really stoic and had sort of hermit-like tendencies to just run away and not want to engage with people and hide and not be emperor a lot of the time, which is a totally fine way for a person to be if that's what you're like. But it's not the best way to be if you were the Roman emperor at this point in time. So if you will recall, Agrippina's mother and others were pretty sure Tiberius had been responsible for the murder of Germanicus, who might have also just died of getting a cut infected. Anyway, so Agrippina's mother basically was just she blamed Tiberius for the death of her husband. And she just sort of started running around and seizing as much power and influence as she could to try and destroy Tiberius, while Tiberius just sort of hid away on an island, not wanting to be emperor, basically. And this was the next sort of 15 years. This sort of power play went on. So basically, this comprised much of the childhood and young adolescence of Agrippina the Younger. So in the midst of all of this, Agrippina the Younger was married at age 14 to a man named Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. And that's 3 different words. And his last name, Ahenobarbus, means bronze beard, which means he had red hair. And their son that she's going to have with him later also has red hair. So I'm just as a red hair person myself, I'm always excited to encounter red hair people in stories. Anyway, we're going to call her husband Domitius because that is what most people called him back then. He was about 20 years older than her, which wasn't weird for that time and or place. They were also related, which wasn't weird either. They were distantly enough related that it wasn't a weird thing. Spoiler, she's going to later have another husband who's much more closely related, and that was treated as weird. So Domitius's mother was Agrippina's great-grand aunt Octavia, who was the sister of Augustus and the previous wife of Mark Antony, which just bunch of important people. He's an important person. He's a lot older than Agrippina, and he also is connected through blood relations to the beloved Emperor Augustus. So basically, they became the new it couple. Domitius was a high-ranking official. He was extremely rich, and he was also, according to literally every source who ever wrote about him, a really heinous and awful person. For instance, one time he apparently killed a slave because the slave was less drunk than Domitius was, and that bothered him. Another time he ripped out a man's eye because he felt that the man had been rude to him. He also apparently would seduce and or assault most women he ever met with or without their consent. So basically he was awful. Agrippina was 14, and that is the husband that she landed with. But basically she'd lived through a pretty chaotic 14 years so far, and I'm sure that her mother and her female relatives maybe gave her some advice about how to not be murdered by this horrible person she was married to. And so basically, the feud between her mother and the emperor continued. The whole thing was just over the top, melodramatic, wildly interesting, and we don't have time to get into all of it. But basically, it culminates with the emperor runs away to Capri, the island of Capri, and never returns. Agrippina was accused of incest. Some people actually maybe had incest. Side note on incest, which is basically, it was a thing that people in ancient Roman times seemed to accuse each other of a lot, not necessarily because it was happening a lot, but because it was kind of the grossest, worst thing you could say about a person. So there's just a lot of people in the story are going to be accusing a lot of other people of incest. There probably wasn't actually that much incest happening, I'm guessing, because it seems like it was such a social taboo that it was accusing someone of it destroyed their whole life, or you wanted it to destroy their whole life. So probably it wasn't a thing people were up to. Anyway, a lot of dramatic things happened. Agrippina's mother and her 2 older brothers had all at various points been sent into exile, put in prison, and all 3 of them, I believe, had all died by suicide to avoid being murdered by Tiberius, basically. The only surviving family members Agrippina had at this point were her brother Gaius, who was off living in exile in Capri with Emperor Tiberius because he was maybe sort of his heir, and two other sisters, Drusilla and Livilla. And then the next major plot twist happens in the year 37. Tiberius finally died, and Agrippina's brother Gaius was named the new emperor. Gaius was his birth name, but you might know him better by his nickname, which was Little Boots, or as it is said in Latin, Caligula. So Caligula was Agrippina's younger brother and the oldest/only surviving boy in her particular branch of this very messy family tree. I guess this is just a little side note on Caligula to explain kind of what's about to happen, which is just a lot of interesting things. So Caligula had spent some time in jail when their mother was sent to jail/exile. And then when she died, he went to live with Agrippina and his two other sisters, Drusilla and Livilla, in the care of in the household of just like mighty women in this what's the thing called? Just this house of super powerful badass women, basically. It's sort of Steel Magnolias, but ancient Rome scenario. So the thing is that, Tiberius saw Caligula as basically the guy who was going to be probably emperor after him, but Tiberius was also really paranoid about someone trying to steal the throne away from him, because everybody constantly was. So is that paranoia when it's true? Anyway, so to keep Caligula from being able to emerge and take over before Tiberius died / kill Tiberius, Tiberius arranged it so that Caligula would be treated like a little boy way longer than most people were then. So there's a whole thing where sort of like a bar mitzvah scenario where a little Roman boy would finally get his toga for the first time. And when you get your toga, there's a toga ceremony. And it's at that point, it's you are a man. I think you could vote at that point. And this happened when people were I don't know, 14, 15, 16. But Caligula was not allowed to do this. He was sent to live with Tiberius on his hermit island in Capri, where Caligula stayed from ages 19 till 27. Presumably he got his toga at some point in there, but it's still very embarrassing. And so he was raised away from Rome, away from the Senate, away from learning how to be the emperor, away from learning how to be an adult person, all of which to say what happened during his reign isn't entirely his own fault. He'd been kind of set up to fail in a lot of ways. But at the beginning, everybody in Rome was really excited for Caligula to take over because no one had ever really liked Tiberius because he was not a very good emperor, what with the running away and hiding all the time. Caligula was still, he was the son of Germanicus. He was the daughter of Agrippina the Elder. He was the son from this beloved family that they had all these parades for. And so everyone was excited to have just a young emperor. Tiberius had been 77 when he died. So just this new young energy from this beloved royal family. So Rome was super excited. They welcomed him and his three sisters back to Rome, basically, and everyone thought everything kind of seems pretty great. But Caligula, even though he hadn't been raised being groomed to be the emperor or know how to be a politician, etc., he knew from just growing up in this situation that people could take away your power at any moment, and he needed to sort of find reasons for people to keep believing in him and for people to not turn on him. And so knowing how popular his parents were and his family was, so he sort of elevated his three sisters to be look, it's me and my three sisters. You loved our parents. We're these young, cool people. So Caligula, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla were sort of a reminder of their father, who everybody had loved, but also of their ancestors, Emperor Augustus and even Julius Caesar. So they were just kind of see, we have this bloodline, look at us, we're this family, you love us. Caligula had not married at this point. He didn't have his own children. So basically he needed his sisters there with him to present himself as a family man sort of person. So he granted his three sisters the same rights as the Vestal Virgins, which the Vestal Virgins is a whole other thing I don't entirely have the ability to explain to you right now, but basically they were women they had the most rights of everybody in Rome. They had rights that other women didn't have. Basically, they were able to make independent decisions about their lives without requiring the permission of a male relative. Their bodies were seen as sacred. Touching them was punishable with death. So Caligula gave those same rights to his 3 sisters. Basically, no Roman women in history, including the wives and mothers of previous emperors, had this amount of autonomy or power. So his 3 sisters were just like elevated to this extent that had no precedent, basically. Every day at the start of Senate, or whenever somebody was introducing like a new bill or whatever into Senate, the men did sort of like the Pledge of Allegiance, where they say like, I promise to honor the emperor, and also I think we should raise minimum wage or whatever. So Caligula changed the wording of this. So every time people said that, they had to say, I promise to honor the emperor and his 3 beloved sisters. So the 3 sisters were they weren't present in Senate because women couldn't be there, but they were seen as almost basically equally as important as the emperor. Caligula had coins made. There's a lot of like big moves made vis-a-vis coins in the story. So he had coins made with his face and name on one side, which was like the normal thing. Usually on the other side was a picture of like a god who the emperor wanted to be like, or a picture of him like an action shot or something. But he put on the other side of the coin his 3 sisters posing like goddesses. And this was the first time that living Roman women had ever been put on coins. Dead Roman women had been, like people's beloved dead mothers and things. And this is the first visual proof that Agrippina herself was a person. So she was a little tiny image on the back of a coin shared with her siblings. And then this is a podcast about Agrippina, not a podcast about Caligula. Perhaps he would be a good topic for a future episode of my Patreon-only spin-off podcast. So this asshole, to get into all the messy stuff that he did. But basically, a bunch of stuff happened really quickly, and we're just kind of looking at how it affected Agrippina. Basically, so towards the end of Caligula's first year as emperor, several important things happened. So firstly, he fell ill of something and retreated from public life for several months. Everybody was really worried he might die. He did not, but he had to retreat for a bit. Agrippina gave birth to her first child around this time. It was a son with red hair, who she named basically the same name as her husband, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. A few attempts were made while Caligula was recuperating during his illness. Other people tried to take over. And at this point, Caligula began his ongoing habit of murdering people who he thought were trying to take over from him. So it's sort of like the PR was flipping. Like at first it's like, yay, this young man, we love him. We love his sisters because their parents were great. This is awesome. But then it started to seem like, oh, this Caligula guy is maybe not quite as awesome as we had thought. But also people at this point were like, ooh, we want to usurp him and have somebody else take over instead. So how can they ruin his name? Rumors of incest. So rumors started to spread around that Caligula and was having sex with his sisters, and he didn't help calm these rumors down by behaving increasingly erratically and losing his shit an awful lot. So he did stuff like smashing pottery, replacing governors of important colonies randomly with random people, running away like Tiberius to just like meditate by himself on an island, stopped shaving his beard, and basically murdering anyone who looked at him funny. So he became a little bit of a tyrant type issue happening. And for reasons we don't know, because unfortunately the records we have that mention Agrippina don't mention this detail, in the year 39, Caligula exiled his sister Agrippina for conspiring against him along with her other sister Livilla. Note that the third sister Drusilla had died 1 year before this happened, which might be part of what caused Caligula's psychological breakdown. Anyway, so there's 2 sisters left, Agrippina and Livilla, and Caligula just exiled them both because he thought they were scheming against him. And this is a whole complicated thing we don't need to get into to understand the effect on Agrippina's life. But basically, the plot was that Agrippina, her sister, and her sister's husband were, well, firstly, Caligula was like, and they're all having sex with each other. Incest. And also he accused that they were trying to raise an army to try and remove him from power. And at this point, it's like, who could blame them if they were trying to do that? He was not doing the best of jobs.
And now for a quick advertising break.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors, including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. At this point, also, Caligula had his own son, which was maybe Agrippina was a bit jealous or nervous about that because she had her own son and she really wanted her son to become the next emperor. Caligula's son would maybe become emperor instead. So some tension between the two of them. Also, Agrippina was really smart and knew what she was doing. Caligula did not know what he was doing. So Agrippina at this point is age 24. And she was sent in exile, but it's not like, oh no, living in like a little prison tent or whatever. She was living in a luxury villa on the island of Pontia. She had a household of slaves, a personal bodyguard, and just kind of had a year to, I mean, it would have upset her, obviously, to be away from Rome, unable to scheme, unable to know what people were saying about her, knowing that at any second her brother could change his mind and kill her. But also she had some time to just like make some plans and just like practice her swimming. And I'm not joking because we learn later she was a really good swimmer. So I think she's probably practicing her swimming. But then in the year 41, so I think she was there for about a year or so, Caligula was assassinated. It seems like that's how most people stop being emperor in my limited research at this point. Anyway, Caligula died of murder and their uncle Claudius was named the new Roman emperor. So Claudius was the brother of their father, Germanicus. So he basically did a military coup and usurped power, and then went back and was like, delete from the historical record the events of this past 2 days. So that happened, and then it was kind of like, and one day Claudius was the emperor and Caligula was dead. That's weird. Who knows what happened? And what also seemed to happen a lot, too, is when a new person took over as emperor, especially in this violent sort of way, they would undo what their predecessor had done to try and show, like, look, I'm different. I'm changing the way things are. So one of the first things Claudius did was he released Agrippina from exile and invited her to join him back in Rome. So she came back to Rome, basically. And what happened next is that, so she's 25 years old. She is reunited with her son, who hadn't been in exile with her. So I'm sure that was very upsetting for her. So her son was 4 years old. She was 25. Oh, and her husband also died. So she was also a widow as well. And just quick side note about Claudius is that he was 50 years old, had barely held any political positions before. He seems to have had some sort of like quirky personality traits that the people in Rome didn't much care for. And also might have had some physical disabilities. He apparently had a limp. He would like drool sometimes, maybe. Like, so people, if you watch I, Claudius, which again, it's a great and interesting way to learn all of these crazy rumors. Everybody in I, Claudius assumed he was an idiot because he had a stutter and a limp, but actually he was the smartest of them all. That's an I, Claudius. In real life, I don't know if he was actually secretly super smart, but he was definitely underestimated and had some sort of physical things going on with his body that made people not respect him as much as others. But he was the emperor, so fuck you. Basically, Claudius was really suspicious of everybody, which makes sense because he himself had just killed his nephew in a military coup, and everyone his whole life was always killing each other. So the only people he trusted were his own freed slaves, like former people who were former enslaved people who he had freed, known as freedmen. So he sort of elevated them to be his advisors, and his family members were other people he trusted. And then again, and he had a new wife who he trusted, which is like, oh God, okay. So his new wife was a teenager named Messalina, and she had had a son named Britannicus, who became the emperor's. Everyone assumed that would be probably the next emperor after Claudius, which again, Agrippina would be like, ooh, I wanted my son to be the next emperor. Then Messalina had this son. Oh, and he was named Britannicus because Claudius was he was the emperor at the time that Rome invaded Britain and started colonizing over there. So the son's name at first wasn't Britannicus and was changed to Britannicus, sort of like Agrippina's father's name was changed to Germanicus after he conquered some areas over there. Oh, and then also Claudius, pretty shortly after taking over, executed Agrippina's only remaining sibling, her sister Livilla, for the usual random reasons, basically scheming, potential adultery, who knows at this point. But basically Agrippina, age 26, the only surviving member of her entire family, basically. Both of her parents were dead. All of her brothers were dead. Both of her sisters were dead. She was still alive. And I don't think that's an accident because she just really knew her shit and she knew what she was doing. So she took a new husband after she came back to Rome, and her new husband had an even longer name than the first husband. He's 4 names. Gaius Sallustius Crispus Passienus. He was vaguely related to her because everybody is vaguely related to everybody else. It's sort of like the Kardashian Jenners, Hadid, whole thing, Fosters in a way. Anyway, so her new husband, we'll call him Crispus. I'm just choosing one of his 4 names that's easiest for me to pronounce. So he was her former brother-in-law, meaning he had been previously married to Agrippina's first husband's sister, which I think makes him the least actually related to her out of all of her husbands. Spoiler. He sounds like total upgrade personality-wise from her first husband in the sense of he was like a pretty straight-up guy. He's known for making jokes, getting along with everybody. The fact that no one had murdered him to this point spoke well of him as a person. He's not known for ripping out the eyes of people who look at him funny. But he was a step down for Agrippina in the sense of he was not as important as her first husband. And he was also friends with Claudius. So the whole thing was kind of like the emperor just like giving his friend a gift, which was marriage to his niece. But also it was sort of like Claudius wanted to use some of Agrippina's still leftover rock star popularity. Like her whole family had been murdered / killed themselves / like the family was still so beloved. And I think that was a lot of what was keeping Agrippina from being murdered at this point. So Claudius just wanted to hitch himself close to her star. But also he didn't want her to get too powerful because she could maybe usurp him and maybe her son would take over. Everyone is just suspicious of everybody else for great reasons, murder reasons. So Claudius literally got Agrippina out of his way by sending her and her husband off to Asia, where they lived as a year while Crispus served as the governor. They returned to Rome, and a couple of very suspicious things happen, such as Crispus, her husband, wrote a new will that made Agrippina the sole beneficiary of his estate, and then he suddenly died. And if this was an episode of Murder, She Wrote, we'd all be like, ooh, okay. Like, you change your will to leave it all to your wife, and then you die is like, she probably killed him. I mean, right? But basically, Crispus got a super public funeral, another like triumph march, etc. Agrippina got to be in yet another parade this time, but now she's 28, which is just like so young. What an eventful life. She's a double widow. She's a single mother. She's the only living descendant of Julius Caesar and Augustus. And everybody still just fucking loves her, basically. And then 5 years pass. So there's rumors that she killed her husband so she could marry someone else, but she didn't marry someone else. So that's where it's like, did she kill her husband? Unclear. She's going to maybe kill some other people. So this is where people are tracking back and maybe trying to see where she started practicing murders. But anyway, 5 years pass. During this time, she was maybe hanging out like in one of the other villas that she had inherited from her rich dead husband, maybe practicing her swimming some more. But basically during these 5 years, Claudius's wife, Messalina, went from being a teenager to being 20. And she sort of took over as the number one most talked about Roman woman. And I can't avoid talking about Messalina because it affects Agrippina, but also it's just like, oh my God. So Messalina was the third wife of Claudius. She was 18 when she married him, when he was 50, when he was the emperor. She was also, in some random way, descended from Augustus, etc., which made her a good wife for Claudius because she was more directly descended from them. And the whole thing was everybody, like, you were more beloved the more directly descended you were from Augustus, basically. So they had a daughter named Octavia. They had their son, Britannicus. There hadn't been... Messalina and Agrippina feuded a lot, I think, largely because they both really wanted their own sons to become the emperor next, but also they were just like both really opinionated, strong-minded women. They were both really ruthless. There was a lot of scheming. Similar to Agrippina, a lot of stuff written about almost everything written about Messalina actually was written after her death, and it was sort of defamatory because of people saw what happened to her, but also because she had a lot of enemies. So there's a lot of sexy scandals about her, like that she lived in a whorehouse and like was a sex worker and like challenged another sex worker to a contest to see who could have sex with the most men in a row, and like lots of stuff that's included in I, Claudius, the miniseries, if you want to watch that. How much of it is true, I don't know. But what the weirdest story about her is the one that is true, which is basically she had a lover who was not her much older husband. And when Claudius was out of town, Messalina decided to marry her lover in a public ceremony. So it's not even like a secret sexy marriage. It was like everyone knew about it. Claudius obviously found out about it and had her executed along with 8 men suspected of helping her out. And like, why in the biography of Agrippina, the one by Emma Southern, she sort of theorizes it's almost like a slow motion suicide. Like Messalina would have known that this wasn't going to turn out. So like, what was she doing? I don't know. But Claudius had her name erased from all historical records and monuments like she'd never existed. Sort of like how when he took over in a military coup, he had all records of those 2 days deleted. Claudius was just all about erasing public record. Anyway, less than 3 months later, Claudius took a new wife, who was Agrippina, who is, yes, his niece. So that's what happened. Despite the fact that people in here were marrying their like second cousin once removed, or like someone who they share a great-great-grandmother with, like for an uncle to marry a niece was basically as fucked up in ancient Rome as it would be if someone did that now. Everyone thought it was weird, inappropriate, gross. Because remember, this is a culture where when you really wanted to say something bad about somebody else, you would accuse them of incest. Like incest was like the worst thing you could accuse somebody of. And this like was incest. So if we set aside the fact that they're related, let's just look at like, how does this make sense as a match, basically? So Claudius, age 59. Agrippina is what, like 32, I think. So she was a descendant of Augustus, which is always a benefit. Claudius wanted to ally himself with that family as possible. She was also still very popular because of her super popular parents, and everybody remembered that. Her son was also more directly descended from Augustus than Claudius's son was, so that could be a selling point as well. She's also rich and smart, very capable, and clearly a really cool person. And what was in it for her was that, well, she'd be the wife of the emperor, which basically elevates her to as much power as she could possibly get. She'd always grown up with a sense that she was better than everyone and destined for great things. And this might have seemed like basically her best chance to like seize onto that and get the power that she felt like she deserved for who she was. It would also, she would assume, cement the future for her son. And she had always been sort of like Margaret Beaufort was in the Tudor era. Just like she was all about clearing the way so her son could have as much power as possible. And also Claudius was older than her, so she might think, I'll be married to him for a bit, but then eventually I'll hopefully be the emperor's mother, which was also still a pretty powerful position, or it could be. It had been for other people before her. So basically, it wasn't legal. Like, it was illegal for an uncle and a niece to get married because incest reasons. But Claudius sort of manipulated the Senate to change the law to allow this weird, gross marriage to happen. And he did it in such a way that it almost seems like the Senate ended up being like, please, Claudius, won't you marry her? And it was whatever. They got married on January 1st in the year 49. But even though the law had been changed, everyone, like, I just want to emphasize, it wasn't like with the Cleopatra story where it's just like brothers and sisters got married, whatever. That's just what happened. Like in Rome, this is like really fucking weird. Claudius's former best friend, Silanus, killed himself the day of the wedding to sort of make a point that this was like really fucking gross thing to do. But get married they did. And then 3 things happened quite quickly, which were that Claudius formally adopted Agrippina's son, changed his name to Nero, and married Nero off to Claudius's daughter, Octavia. So it was like a double marriage. Like the 2 parents got married, and then their kids got married to each other. And it's just a big old incest bath bomb. I don't know. Agrippina demanded that a man named Seneca, who's a famous sort of philosopher person who had been exiled by Caligula, Agrippina demanded that he be returned to be Nero's new tutor because he was like the smartest person and she wanted the best tutor for her son. And a woman named Lolia Paulina was accused of witchcraft, sent into exile, and died. This part I'm going to explain a bit. Why does that matter? So Lolia Paulina was a woman who had been briefly married to Caligula. He had several wives. He kept getting bored of them and getting new wives. When Claudius was looking for a new wife after the whole Messalina scenario, Lolia Paulina had been suggested as maybe a possible woman that he could marry. But he, of course, married his niece instead. And this is, again, where it's like, allegedly, did Agrippina conspire to kill Lolia Paulina to remove her as a rival for her uncle/husband? Maybe, basically. But this is sort of another rumored person that perhaps Agrippina was responsible for killing. Anyway, after 1 year of marriage, Claudius had Agrippina... He gave her the title Augusta. So remember, Octavian became Augustus. So Augusta was a title that kind of meant not quite empress, but basically a huge honor. Agrippina was only the 3rd woman in history to be given this title. And it was the first time that the title was given to the living wife of the current emperor. So this title had been previously given to the mother of the emperor and a dead mother of another emperor, I think. Basically, this title meant that she was more or less on equal standing with Claudius, the emperor. No woman in Western history had ever had this much power before in terms of like her role in the empire and how big the empire was. She also she was involved in things. Like she was an active figure who sat beside her husband during business meetings. Like she helped run things. She wasn't just like decorative. Like she was actually in there getting shit done. For instance, in the year 50, she founded a new Roman colony in the place near where she had been born in Germany. The colony was originally called Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, which is a long name, and so people started calling it Colonia Agrippinensium, then later just Colonia, and now it's called Cologne, and it's still a city in Germany. So she was the patron of this colony, and it was a place where like retired military people would go to live. She, paid money to improve things there, install, the Roman famous sewage systems, etc. The Romans lived apparently like pretty multiculturally with the indigenous Yubi people who were in the area already, and it was a successful little colony. And then more coin-related news. So she was placed in a coin opposite her husband in the year 50. So when she had been on the coin with Caligula on one side, it was her and her sisters on the other side. But this time, it was her and Claudius, and it was kind of like the two faces, both facing the same way. His face was in front and hers was behind, but she was on the front of a coin. So it's the first time ever a woman had been on a coin like that. She also commissioned statues made in her likeness that were wearing a diadem, which is a specific kind of crown/tiara that no living Roman woman had ever been shown to wear in a piece of art. So she was just like ensuring that like artistically, culturally, like in every possible level, like people were reminded all the time, she was really fucking important. So the next 3 years continued, more of the same, until Caligula died in the year 54. And an awful lot of people suspected that Agrippina had murdered him. Why was that? So partially it's sort of the Messalina thing, again, where she had enemies, and so the enemies like to spread rumors about her that weren't true, that made her look bad because they wanted her to have less power. So, and especially like her, Agrippina, she had so much power. No woman had ever had this much power before. It really bothered a lot of men. So she had a lot of enemies. And so they were spreading rumors about stuff like Agrippina was too masculine, that she was having sex with lots of men, like she was a whore, she was scheming too much, she wanted to destroy the Roman Empire, etc., etc. Basically, but also a lot of people were murdering a lot of people. So anytime somebody died, like if the emperor died, it's sort of like, if your first guess is he was murdered, you're probably right, basically, looking at statistically. So Claudius was 63 years old when he died, and he had been sick. He had various medical conditions, seemingly, but also it sounds like, so there's a woman called Locusta who was a poisoner. She had been in jail. So she was a convicted poisoner. So, side note on Locusta. So she was apparently a woman who was born in present-day France, was a peasant. She became a master botanist and herbalist, and quickly deduced that Rome, with all the nefarious deeds being carried out by the aristocracy, was the place to make her fortune as a master poisoner. So she became so well known for her skill that she was identified as just Locusta the Poisoner. So she was arrested twice for poisoning people, but she was arrested a third time, and Agrippina actually is the one who released her. But Agrippina said, like, I'll release you, but you need to also do me a favor, and that favor is you need to help me poison my husband, uncle, the emperor, to death. So the problem is that, so they wanted to poison him to death. Claudius really liked mushrooms, but he had a food taster, obviously, because everybody was trying to kill everybody all the time. So what they did was Locusta made sure that the personal assistant, the food taster, was busy that day. Agrippina would distract Claudius with lots of wine, so he wouldn't notice that his food taster is not there. And then they served mushrooms, which were his most favorite thing to eat. Basically, he started having physical symptoms of poisoning. Allegedly, a doctor was was summoned to help out the emperor to save him, but Locusta, and what they were doing was, in a time before, what's it called? Ipecac. So they stuck a feather down his throat to make him throw up, but Locusta had already put poison on the feather, and he died, and that's an amazing story. So he also could have died of natural causes. Who knows? There's another version of this event that Claudius ate the mushrooms and felt sick. So then Agrippina offered him some porridge to try and settle his stomach, but there was poison in the porridge as well. One way or another, the emperor had died and no one could find his will. Again, it's like an Agrippina-related story where it's like, what? No one can find the will? That's not suspicious at all. But she was like, don't worry. He told me what he wants, and he wants Nero to become the next emperor instead of Britannicus. And everyone was like, okay. So she was now 3 times a widow, and now the mother of the emperor, and the emperor was Nero. So where things get complicated here is that basically she was amazing. She got everything she ever wanted, but the problem is that her son was really shitty. So it's very much like Cersei and Joffrey in Game of Thrones, in the sense of like Agrippina was so smart, so clever. She would have been an amazing emperor on her own, but it was a society in which that was not possible. So instead, she has to sit and watch her son be an asshole and ruin everything, basically. So Nero, age 16, was the new emperor. And unlike Caligula or even Claudius, he'd actually been taught how to do this from a very young age, having grown up in Rome, being taught what to do. He had alliances with like army people and other people. Like, so he's in a pretty good position. But the problem is that he actually wanted to be an actor/singer and not emperor. So personality-wise, it was not a great fit. And for the first little while, Agrippina was sort of unofficially like his regent. So he was 16, he had his toga, he was a man, but she had done a really good job sort of running things with Claudius. If you look at Claudius's reign, actually, on almost everything you can measure, things just got better once he married Agrippina. So it seems like she was able to kind of jump in and just handle the books better. Just like her help was really helpful. So I think she thought she could kind of do the same stuff for Nero, who was still just a little kid. And for the first little while, they were always together. Like when he made an appearance somewhere, she'd be with him, just like she had been with Claudius. So she also suggested that she be allowed to attend Senate meetings, which not like in person. That's crazy. She's a woman. But she asked like if she could stand behind a curtain and like listen in on the Senate meetings, which was more than any woman had been able to do before. And before this, what she had to do was rely on secondhand information about who had said what and what went on. But now she could actually like listen in. And then there was more coins drama. She had some new coins commissioned. So this time, like she'd share the one with Claudius where they were both facing the same way, but his face was on top. The new coins that she had done was her and Nero on the front of the coin facing each other. So both of their faces were there in full. So again, like she just kept breaking new ground for like women having power. It was all, and I don't mean this in like, she should have done more, like, but it was all very self-serving. Like she wanted herself to have this power. She wasn't like, I want to make it so the women who follow me will also have all these advantages. Like that wasn't her deal at all. She wasn't like climbing up a ladder and then helping other women up the ladder. She was just like, me, I want this power for me. And unfortunately, as it would turn out, is that a lot of the power that she had was based on like understandings and people assuming things, not actually having laws written or changed for her, which meant, spoiler, when it all started to come undone, like she didn't have any ground to stand on because it was all just kind of like through her force of will and personality. She like made some stuff change, but like the laws didn't actually change. So she had set herself up as kind of like, she was a wife and a mother, but she never ever presented herself like her mother had been or like Livia had been, who was just kind of like, I'm this good Roman woman who just like stays at home and loves being a wife and mother. And I'm like secretly scheming in the background. She was like scheming out loud in front of everybody. She presented herself as kind of like not traditionally feminine. So she didn't present herself as a man, but also not as a woman. She was just kind of like, I am basically a goddess. And people acted like she was until one day, she started being treated like a woman and everything started to fall apart. So the first major blow was she went in to join Nero in a meeting with some foreign delegations. And Nero she went to sit next to him, which was like even a bold move for her. Usually she should have sat like beside or like behind Claudius, but she went to sit right next to Nero. And Nero basically stopped her and walked her over to a different seat further away from him. So that was like humiliating her in front of this foreign delegation and everybody else. And it was like through body language, a major statement about her loss of power. Nero fell in love with a woman named Acte, and Agrippina wasn't a fan of the relationship, and they had a big fight about it. And Nero, is sort of a fuck you to her, sent her a gift of some jewels and a new dress, which was kind of like his way of saying like, hey, you're just a woman. Here are some woman things. Mind your own business. And especially because Agrippina wasn't a person who was ever interested in like dresses or jewels or being flashy or luxury things. So apparently in response, she said something like, I gave him the empire and he gave me a dress, which is like, ugh, put that on a poster. Sons suck. Sometimes sons suck. So Nero brought in Locusta again to help him murder his stepbrother / cousin Britannicus, who was the son of Claudius, because Nero saw Britannicus as a threat, as somebody who could maybe become emperor instead of him, which is like, it's sort of a shitty thing Nero did, but also like everyone was killing everyone. It's not that different. But basically, he was just clearing the way for himself to have ultimate power, and part of that was he expelled Agrippina from the palace. They made her go live elsewhere. So they were just sort of back and forth fighting about a bunch of random things. And one day Agrippina basically went in, forced her way in to talk to Nero. And we don't know what happened in this like closed door meeting. But at the end of this, they clearly reached some sort of understanding. And based on how stable the government went after this, it seems like the agreement might have been Agrippina will just like secretly run things behind the scenes, but she won't make public appearances or let anyone know that she's doing that, because the next sort of 4 years were okay for her. Nero he put on plays, made everybody listen to him sing, made everybody clap for him, and was just sort of like little baby Caligula tyrant type person. Nero fell in love with a woman named Poppaea Sabina, who has her own interesting story we can talk about another day. But basically, at around the same time he got involved with her, Nero decided it was time to murder his mother. So some of the rumors are that Poppaea was jealous of Agrippina because of like incest reasons, but also maybe she just kind of saw how smart Agrippina was, or maybe Poppaea didn't give a shit. We don't know. But basically, Nero started hanging out with this woman named Poppaea, and around the same time, he decided to try and kill his mother. So, couple things. So Agrippina was friends with Locusta and knew about poisons herself. And so just like that guy in Princess Bride, it turns out she had been secretly dosing herself with small amounts of poison for a really long time, just to make herself like immune to all of them. So apparently Nero tried to poison her, but it didn't work because she was immune to all poisons, which is just kind of like, love that for her. Nero knew that he couldn't just send in the army to stab her because she was still so popular as the daughter of Germanicus. And Germanicus had been this great army leader, and so the army might not listen to those orders and do that. So Nero, who was also just like huge drama queen, literally drama queen, he had seen a play that had a prop boat with like a false floor in it, and he was like, what if we build an actual version of that boat with a like trap door in it, get Agrippina on the boat, and then she like drowns because the boat trap door opens when she's like in open water, which is a ridiculous plan, but it's in every source, and so it seems to be like this is what he wanted to do. So he invited his mother to come and visit him at a villa that he had to take a boat to get to. Agrippina was like, I see what you're up to, and she refused to take his offer of a boat, instead took her own boat up to meet him. They had dinner together, and somehow Nero, I guess using his like acting skills, pretended like he didn't want to kill her, to the point that at the end of the dinner she agreed to take his special boat back home. As per the plan, part of the boat collapsed when they were in the middle of the water and the ship started to sink. But this is where Agrippina, being a great swimmer, pays off, and she's able to swim back to shore, basically.
She arrived back at the villa. People applauded because they were like, oh my God, Agrippina, our beloved Agrippina almost died, but she didn't. Look at her. She's an amazing swimmer. We love her so much. The daughter of Germanicus. So she had a messenger send a message back to Nero saying that she was still alive. Did she know that he had tried to kill her? I mean, probably at this point. But so the note was just basically like, guess what? Foiled you again. People were just like weeping and praying all around her house. Like, again, the only comparison I can think of from contemporary anything is like Princess Diana's death. Like, people are just so grateful that she hadn't died. But what happened is that later that night, when she was in bed, soldiers came marching up, and they had sort of fake charges from Nero. So Nero claimed Agrippina had tried to kill him, and the soldiers came in to murder her, basically. She tried to talk them out of it. But they were having none of that. And basically her final act is that she flung open her robe to reveal her womb, saying, like, stab me here, like, if you're really from my son. And then they did. And then she died aged 44. So Agrippina, she achieved more individual power than any Roman woman before her, and no other Roman woman would for basically another 100 years when the 3rd century Syrian matriarchy came along. These were 3 Roman noblewomen who were pretty awesome people themselves. They were called Julia Domna, Julia Soamias, and Julia Mamea, and they wound up getting similar levels of power. But basically, Agrippina was kind of it for a while. Shortly after she died, and that's the story of Agrippina. So again, I just want to shout out my main source of information about this. The reason I even started learning about Agrippina was because I read this biography, which is amazing. So it's the biography of Agrippina by Emma Southen, which I recommend heartily. You can read it as a book. You can also read it on audible.com, which is my little sponsor. So if you go to audibletrial.com/vulgarhistory, you can look up, you can get your free trial, and maybe your free trial could be reading Emma Southen's biography of Agrippina, which I read as an audiobook and which is really fun to read in that way. Actually, I read it as an audiobook / as a book. I was kind of bouncing back and forth. It's really, really good. And now it is time for us to score her. So there's four metrics that we score people on for Vulgar History, and the first is scandaliciousness. So there's a number of things here for scandal for Agrippina. We've got the just her whole family situation. That's not her specifically, but she's growing up in this wild family situation. We've got the marrying her uncle. We've got the maybe poisoning her husband to death. We've got the maybe poisoning her uncle husband to death. We've got the maybe killing of other people. Like, the liciousness of her scandals, I think, is quite high. I'm going to give her, I think, a 9. The next category is scheminess. And this is like flat out 10. Like, she schemed, like, she schemed behind the scenes. Then when she got more power, she was scheming out in public by like making things like the new rules so she could hide behind the curtain and listen into the Senate. Like, she was, I feel like even in her sleep, she was scheming. Just like so much scheming. So the next measure is significance. And this is tricky because she was very significant in her time. She herself didn't really pave the way for other people. So she didn't really, in that sense, but also in terms of the significance of, because of her, basically, she's the reason why Nero became the emperor. He wasn't a good emperor. In fact, I believe he was the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But the fact that she was basically instrumental in making her son be emperor is pretty significant. This is tricky. I think I'm going to give her, I feel like a 6 for significance. And the final category is sexism. This is where the bonus, basically, how much more could she have achieved if she was a man? Like, how much did her gender affect what she did in life? And I mean, in every conceivable way, really. She would have been a great emperor if a woman could be an emperor, but she couldn't be an emperor. But she kind of didn't let that stop her. But then it kind of did her in at the end. It's tricky for her with the sexism. She achieved a lot in spite of sexism. So it's not like sexism held her back. Oh, it's tricky. I'm going to give her a 6 for sexism. So that's 31. That is
Agrippina takes the lead. I mean, not that it's a contest, but just in terms of like who scores the highest on these 4 metrics. She's the first over 31. So last week we did Cleopatra. She was 28. From season 1, Elizabeth Bathory was 29, but Agrippina, 31. Kind of proud of her. And so that's Agrippina the Younger. My God. Okay, so just a couple of things to say to wrap things up. So again, if you want to support the show and also listen to a cool book, if you go to audibletrial.com/vulgarhistory, sign up for a trial with Audible, and some of that helps support us financially a little bit. And Emma Southan's biography of Agrippina is a book that I think would be a great choice to listen to. You can also, if you want to just straight up support me and this podcast and the other writing I'm doing, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. And you can find us on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, Twitter at Vulgar History. And thank you so much for listening in. Oh, and I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. So if you do go on the Patreon, I do have a spin-off podcast there that's Patreon only. So This Asshole, which is where I look at the stories of some of the men who happen to be involved in the lives of the women that we talk about on Vulgar History. As of the time of this recording, there's 2 episodes up there, and I think more. I feel like Caligula and possibly Nero also, maybe even Claudius, like they could each have their own little episode of that as well. But anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you all next time.
So with the Cleopatra, Anne's version that I released 2 weeks ago, I guess, and then I did the special Cleopatra discussion with Gina Berry. Cleopatra, like I needed to write that wrong. I scored her much too low. Agrippina, I think the score still stands. She's got a 31. And in terms of the show, and if you keep up with the Scandalicious scale, which you can actually see all of them if you go to vulgarhistory.com and you hit on score, you can see where everybody is in the Scandaliciousness scale. I think Agrippina is right at home. She's right at home. I think a 31. Anything above 30 is quite remarkable for somebody on the show. I think where she falls short in terms of like not getting up to like a Fredegund level of 38, it's similar to Fredegund's own issue, which was that the people around her were also messy bitches. And Agrippina was scandalous, but kind of everyone kind of also was. You know, I can't give top marks in that category when that's the situation. So Agrippina, I mean, definitely one of the most important women in ancient Rome, as the subtitle of Emma Southan's book says. And it's just exciting to revisit this episode now with my new I Claudius lens on all of it. And so I do want to also mention Agrippina the Younger is one of the designs you can get on a beautiful piece of jewelry by our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So Common Era Jewelry, I do like when things synchronize, where someone I talk about is a person who they have on their jewelry. So Common Era Jewelry, our brand partner. So this is a small business. It's a woman-owned business, and they are making beautiful heirloom pieces of jewelry. They make pendants, they make rings. All their stuff is made entirely in New York City. Everybody involved in the company has healthcare and good wages. Even the packaging is made by a little family-owned business in Chicago. And basically, the reason why I connected with them in the first place is, first of all, because several of you shared this company with me and thought, like, this made me think of you. And I contacted Tori, the owner, and I was like, do you want to like work together? And she's like, hell yeah. So here we are. So her designs are inspired by classical mythology as well as women from history. She has a whole collection called the Difficult Women Collection, which includes Agrippina, is somebody who's on there. And last week's heroine Cleopatra, you can also get her on your jewelry, as well as next week's person we're talking about, which is going to be Boudica. And if you're like, that's not how you pronounce Boudica, it's Boadicea or whatever, like stay tuned for next week, because I talk about the pronunciation and I really thought about the pronunciation and I came to a conclusion and I pronounce it like Boudica. Anyway, Boudica also is there on the Difficult Women collection from Common Era. There's also people from classical mythology. Medusa is there, Aphrodite. From my Sapphic, Sappho is one of the options as well. Their pieces are available in solid gold as well as in more affordable gold vermeil. And you, listening right now, Vulgar History listener, You can always get 15% off your order, all items in your order from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at the checkout. And I also have, this is just where I just let you know, if you don't know me, if you don't know what the vibe is, if you don't know what's going on here, I also have a Substack newsletter, which is where you can get an email newsletter of my writing every alternate week. If you subscribe to that on Substack, which you don't have to like become a Substack member or whatever, you can just like truly just subscribe to it. If you go to vulgarhistory.substack.com, there it is. And so what I'm posting about there are essays about women from history, sort of inspired by the name of the collection from Common Era. Actually, I'm calling my new series Difficult Women. My previous series there was called Tudor, I Hardly Knew Her. And I was talking about all the ladies of the Tudor era. And now I'm kind of branching out into other things. So some of them are people I've talked about on the podcast and some of them are not. But if you want to see what my writing is like, check it out on Substack as well. It's free. And I do also want to mention that I am on the most recent episode of a podcast called Ticklish Business. And if you don't know Ticklish Business, it is a podcast about old Hollywood movies. It's hosted by Kristen Lopez and Emily Edwards. And basically they just talk about classic old Hollywood movies each time. It was just Kristen's birthday, and so she decided to talk about one of her favorite movies of all time, which is called Anne of the Thousand Days. And it is a movie from 1969 about Anne Boleyn. And she invited me on, and I was really excited to be on. I hadn't seen that movie before. I was nervous. Like, oh my God, what if I don't like the movie? Like, I have to be honest on this podcast. But honestly, Geneviève Bujold, a French-Canadian actress, plays Anne Boleyn, and she is stunning. Like, for me, my Anne Boleyn on film, not that I've seen all of them, but like Natalie Dormer was it for me. I was just like, Natalie Dormer, her Anne Boleyn, like it's just iconic. But then when I saw Geneviève Bujold, I'm like, she's up there too. Like, she's up there too. It's just like, of course somebody would like throw away their marriage, change the religion of their country for her. She is amazing in this movie. And I had a lot of fun talking about it. So anyway, just look for Ticklish Business is the name of the podcast. I'll put that link in the show notes as well. I have some other guest spots on some other podcasts coming up soon too. I'm excited to be doing more of that sort of thing. And if you, listener, have a podcast and you want me to be a guest on it, I mean, reach out. And if anyone else wants to reach out to me for other reasons, you can as well. So you can find me on Instagram, where I am at Vulgar History Pod, and my DMs are open there. You can also go to my website, vulgarhistory.com, and there's a little thing to like contact me, and you can fill in your little form and let me know what you want to talk to me about. And I'm just back from my holiday, y'all, and I'm getting back in the vibe of recording podcasts. I'm just like, all the things. What are the things that I say? Oh yeah, speaking of my holiday. So I was just on a trip. I was in London. I was in Edinburgh. I was in Braunschweig, Germany. I was briefly in Hanover, Germany. I had a layover in the Amsterdam airport. It was the first time that I've traveled internationally in, I think, more than 10 years. And it was really exciting for me, and I got a lot out of it. And part of what was really fun was taking pictures of things and knowing that I could then share them with you, the Tits Out Brigade, my podcast listeners who get it, who would know why it's thrilling to see things like John Knox's grave, to see in Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, the Darnley's secret sex stairs, Rizzio's death stain, why I freaked out fully when I saw Caroline of Brunswick and Frances Howard's portraits at the National Portrait Gallery in London. I also got to hang out with some alpacas. I got my Anne de Arauso on. Anyway, so I want to share that with everybody. So I've been posting like a couple of pictures on my Instagram, which again is Vulgar History Pod. But if you want to read all my travel blogs, which I think just wrapped up today when you're listening to this, you can go to my Patreon, which you can join for free to see these sorts of blogs. So all my exciting adventures, my travel blogs are at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. And yeah, so you can see just pictures and kind of my commentary about what I saw and what I hoped to have seen, but did not see. And anyway, so that's what you get if you can go to Patreon and just become a free member. If you want to support the podcast on Patreon, you can become a paid member, which means you can see the travel blogs, which everybody can anyway. You just have to be a free member. But if you join as a paid member, you can pay $1 a month and you get early ad-free access to all episodes of this podcast, as well as to an ad-free version of all the old episodes. And for $5 a month, you get all of the above, plus also bonus episodes of Vulgar Peace Theater, which is where I talk about costume dramas with friends of the podcast, Allison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. We've been on hiatus for a bit because it's summer and I was traveling and lots is going on. Allison's got a book that is coming out soon that we'll be talking about more. But anyway, I think we're going to get back into Vulgar Peace Theater probably in the next little bit. But in the meantime, you can join the Patreon for the $5 a month and listen to our back catalog. We talk about Newsies. We talk about the Les Miserables movie with Russell Crowe. We also talk about bananas movies like Queen Margot. It's always a good time when every episode is like 3 hours long. So if you're looking for that, that's where you can find that. And we also have Vulgar History merch. I do want to say I was wearing a t-shirt from the Vulgar History merch collection. I was wearing the Peg Plunkett's Pub design by Karen Moynihan when I was doing my trip, because I did host the first ever Vulgar History meetups in London and in Edinburgh. And I wore that shirt just so people would recognize me. And so I think, having now experienced this, I think if you get, or if you own Vulgar History merch and you're wearing one of these shirts, and when someone recognizes you, it'll be a cool feeling because you'll know you're in the Tits Out Brigade and you'll know that you'll be friends now. You can get this merch at vulgarhistory.com/store. Which is great if you're in the US. If you're outside the US, I would recommend going to our alternate store, which is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com, and peruse the stuff there. And I don't know, pins, mugs, lots of things. And as I mentioned, I'm on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. I'm also on Threads, same name, Vulgar History Pod. And yeah, next week, Boudica, just reconsidering that again. Do we like her score? Do we not like her score? You know what? Let me know what you think about that. And anyway, my friends, we're back at it, and I'll talk to you next week. So until then, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Talmor, Sheshin Morachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Contained herein are the heresies of Redolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Redolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.